In the sultry autumn of 1865, along the waterfront of Victoria Harbour in the newly established British Crown colony of Hong Kong, three-masted clipper ships and steam gunboats rode at anchor in waters thick with coal smoke, sea mist, and the sharp scent of tropical brine. Across the bustling granite quays of Queen's Road, lines of Chinese coolies in straw hats and European shipping agents in linen suits rolled wooden casks of Spanish silver dollars and heavy, iron-banded chests of Malwa, Patna, and Benares opium, past the classical stone colonnades of newly erected British merchant houses. Great Britain had fought two devastating, high-stakes wars against the Qing Empire to force open the ports of imperial China, seizing the barren, rocky island of Hong Kong as a permanent sovereign enclave for British commerce and maritime power. The trade that flowed through these waters was the most lucrative commercial operation in the 19th century, an oceanic circuit of narcotics, silver, silk, and tea that underpinned the financial stability of the entire British Empire in Asia. To the merchants of the City of London and the colonial administrators in Whitehall, Hong Kong was celebrated as a shining monument to the virtues of free trade, Victorian enterprise, and the global spread of British commercial law. Luxury neoclassical mansions were rising on the cool green slopes of Victoria Peak, while European trading firms like Jardine, Matheson and Company, Dent and Company, and Russell and Company dominated the coastal trade from Canton and Amoy to Shanghai and Yokohama. The sea lanes of the South China Sea were guarded by the steam ironclads of the Royal Navy, and the British commercial empire appeared destined to expand indefinitely across the Asian continent. In the lavish dining rooms of the newly opened Hong Kong Club, merchant princes toasted their soaring export volumes in French champagne, confident that British naval power and Scottish commercial thrift had opened an inexhaustible market of 400 million Chinese consumers. Overseas trade was expanding at a pace never before seen in human history, and British clippers like the Falcon and the Red Rover raced across the Indian Ocean to deliver fresh crops of Indian narcotics to the receiving ships anchored off the Pearl River. Yet behind the polished mahogany counters of the colony's commercial houses, the entire economic machine was operating under the shadow of a severe, structural currency crisis. There was no local bank capable of financing the vast exchange operations between China, India, and London, leaving the merchants vulnerable to the predatory discount rates of distant banks in London and Calcutta. The stage was set for the creation of an unprecedented financial institution, a bank that would not be established by royal charter in London, but by the leading narcotic syndicates of the China coast. It would become the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, an institution born directly from the profits of the opium trade that would grow to manage the finances of empires, issue the official currency of Hong Kong, and anchor the financial architecture of modern East Asia. In the corporate archives of the HSBC Group in London, there is preserved the original handwritten prospectus of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, drafted on a coastal steamship in 1864 by a 30-year-old Scottish shipping clerk. Written in crisp black ink on blue-lined ledger paper, the founding document outlined a revolutionary concept: a local bank, owned and directed by the principal merchant houses of the China coast, designed to capture the immense profits of the international exchange business. For over a century, official corporate histories have celebrated HSBC as the pioneering champion of modern banking in the Far East, a pillar of financial rectitude and commercial development. But behind the formal prose of that 1864 prospectus lay an undeniable historical reality. More than 80% of the founding capital and commercial business of the bank came from trading firms whose primary source of revenue was the importation of illegal Indian opium into imperial China. How did a commercial cartel form to settle the narcotics bills of a shattered empire, transform itself into one of the largest and most powerful financial institutions in the modern world. To understand why British merchants needed to invent a new banking institution in 1865, one must examine the staggering macroeconomic scale of the opium trade and the severe silver crisis that plagued 19th-century East Asia. In the late 18th century, Great Britain faced a catastrophic trade deficit with imperial China. The British public had developed an insatiable cultural addiction to Chinese black and green tea. Between 1780 and 1830, British annual tea consumption exploded from £2 per person to over £30 million for the nation as a whole. The British East India Company was legally obligated to supply this immense tea demand, purchasing millions of chests of tea and silk from the monopolistic Chinese merchant guild, the Kohong, at the single open port of Canton. But the Qing Empire operated on a strict hard silver standard and refused to accept British-manufactured goods, Birmingham woolens, or Manchester cottons in exchange. The Chinese Qianlong Emperor famously informed King George III that China possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no need for the manufactures of outside barbarians. As a result, silver was pouring out of the British Treasury, the Bank of England, and London merchant vaults at a ruinous rate of over 20 million ounces per year. British public finance was bleeding to death to pay for breakfast tea. To reverse this catastrophic drain of bullion, the British East India Company engineered the most lucrative, state-directed narcotics monopoly in world history. Across the fertile plains of Bengal, Bihar, and Malwa in British India, the colonial government forced peasant farmers' riots to cultivate the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, processing the raw sap in massive state-owned factories in Patna and Benares. The trade expanded with terrifying exponential speed. In 1800, fewer than 4,000 chests of opium were smuggled into China each year. By 1820, that number had doubled to 8,000 chests. By 1838, on the eve of the First Opium War, imports reached 40,000 chests, each containing over 130 pounds of processed, dark sticky drug balls. Following Britain's military victory in the First Opium War and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and the subsequent Second Opium War concluding in 1860 with the Convention of Peking, the importation of opium was legally forced upon the Qing Empire under British military protection. By 1865, annual opium imports into China exceeded 80,000 chests, worth over 35 million Spanish silver dollars annually, representing more than 16% of the total gross tax revenues of the British Empire in India. This massive flow of narcotics reversed the global flow of money. Between 1820 and 1860, an estimated 100 million pounds sterling in solid silver drained out of imperial China into the hands of British trading firms, creating severe deflation, monetary collapse, and fiscal paralysis across the Qing Empire. But this immense flood of silver created a logistical and financial nightmare for the British merchants operating on the China coast. Local currency markets were chaotic. Transactions were settled in an erratic mixture of Mexican silver dollars, Spanish Carolus dollars, Indian silver rupees, and unminted silver ingots known as syce, measured by weight in taels. European exchange banks with headquarters in London, such as the Oriental Bank Corporation, the Chartered Bank of India, Australia and China, and the Commercial Bank of India, charged exorbitant fees to discount commercial paper, took 4 to 6 months to clear transactions by mail, and kept their bullion reserves thousands of miles away in England, leaving the China trade chronically starved of local credit. When a sudden financial panic in Bombay in 1864, triggered by the collapse of the American Civil War cotton boom, caused the failure of several Anglo-Indian banks, the China merchants faced a devastating credit crunch. 14 of the most powerful merchant houses in Hong Kong, led by opium giants Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company, Russell and Company, Fletcher and Company, and the Baghdadi Sassoon dynasty, decided to take matters into their own hands. They subscribed 5 million Hong Kong dollars in initial capital to incorporate a local bank that would retain all exchange profits in the colony and provide uninterrupted credit lines for their maritime operations. On March 3, 1865, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation opened its doors for business. The man who conceived the structure of this new financial powerhouse was not an experienced international banker or an elite City of London financier. His name was Thomas Sutherland, a sharp, ambitious 30-year-old Scot from Aberdeen who had risen through the ranks of the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, known as the P&O Line. Born in 1834, the son of a modest merchant navy captain, Sutherland was educated at Aberdeen Grammar School before entering the London offices of P&O as an apprentice clerk at the age of 18. Sutherland was a master of logistics, corporate organization, and maritime transport. In 1854, P&O dispatched him to Hong Kong to help manage the company's burgeoning steamship routes between Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. At the time, P&O steamships were the primary carriers of both official British Royal Mail and high-value opium chests across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Traveling back and forth along the China coast, Sutherland observed that while the merchant houses were generating astronomical fortunes in trade, they were being ruthlessly exploited by London-based banks that took months to clear transactions and charged punitive discount rates of 7 to 10% on commercial bills of exchange. Sutherland studied the operational methods of the great merchant princes of Hong Kong, particularly William Jardine and James Matheson, who had founded their commercial empire on the premise that sovereign law was merely an obstacle to be overcome by superior commercial organization and armed force. Jardine, a former East India Company ship's surgeon known to the Chinese as the iron-headed old rat for his cold indifference to physical danger and moral appeal, had established a private fleet of heavily armed opium clippers that openly defied Chinese customs bans. Matheson, an Edinburgh-educated intellectual, had traveled to London in the 1830s to lobby Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston to wage war on China to protect their drug investments. In 1864, while traveling aboard a P&O coastal steamer between Hong Kong and Swatow, Sutherland read an article in a newly arrived copy of Blackwood's magazine describing the principles of Scottish joint stock banking. Scottish banks were founded on a simple, powerful model: local ownership, decentralized shareholding among local merchants, cash credit accounts, and the broad issuance of banknote credit backed by commercial assets rather than gold bullion in distant vaults. Sutherland had an epiphany. Why should the merchants of the China coast send their millions in exchange commissions to London when they could establish a Scottish-style joint stock bank right on the waterfront of Hong Kong? Upon returning to the colony, Sutherland moved with remarkable speed. He drafted a concise, 12-page prospectus in a single weekend. Rather than seeking permission from the colonial government in London, Sutherland approached the most prominent merchants in Hong Kong. He secured the immediate backing of Thomas Dent of Dent and Company, William Keswick of Jardine Matheson, Francis Cholmondeley of Dent and Co., and prominent American and German merchants. Sutherland understood that the person who controlled the ledger controlled the trade. By uniting the competing merchant princes of Hong Kong under the board of a single financial institution, Sutherland created an unassailable financial monopoly that would outlive the very trading firms that founded it. Sutherland would later be knighted, serve as the longtime chairman of P&O, and sit in the British Parliament as a respected liberal unionist member, embodying the complete convergence between colonial enterprise, international shipping, and the highest echelons of British political power. the critical founding meeting that gave birth to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, took place on a rain-swept evening in November 1864 in the private library of Dent and Company on Queen's Road in Victoria, Hong Kong. Thomas Sutherland sat at the end of a long mahogany table surrounded by the elite commercial magnates of the Far East. Thomas Dent, who would become the first chairman of the Provisional Committee, William Keswick, the nephew and successor of William Jardine, Robert Brand of Gilman and Company, Arthur Sassoon, representing the powerful Baghdadi Jewish Opium dynasty David Sassoon, Sons and Company, Douglas Laprake, the shipping magnate, and representatives of leading German, Parsi, and American mercantile houses including Russell and Company and Simpson and Company. The atmosphere in the room was tense with urgency. A rival banking promoter in London, the British Bank of China, had just announced on the London Stock Exchange that it intended to issue shares and establish a monopoly on the trade of Hong Kong and Shanghai without consulting a single merchant on the China coast. Sutherland placed his handwritten prospectus on the table and addressed the assembled magnates with calm, piercing clarity. Sutherland told the room, "Gentlemen, the trade of China and Japan is expanding at a rate unmatched in modern history. Yet we remain at the mercy of banking directors sitting in London who know nothing of our business, who drain our bullion away to England, and who restrict our credit whenever a crisis occurs in Europe. If we establish our own bank in Hong Kong, governed by the very merchants who generate the trade, the entire profit of the exchanges will remain in our hands, and we will never again be dependent on the whims of London." The merchants recognized the immense strategic advantage of Sutherland's proposal. The $5 million initial capitalization, divided into 20,000 shares of $250 each, was fully subscribed within hours, with 20,000 shares taken up by the founding houses. When the Provisional Committee approached the British governor of Hong Kong, Sir Hercules Robinson, they encountered bureaucratic resistance from the Colonial Office and the Board of Trade in London. British officials in Whitehall were deeply suspicious of colonial merchants creating their own bank, and were reluctant to grant a royal charter to an institution that insisted on issuing its own paper currency without strict Bank of England reserves. But the merchant houses leveraged their absolute commercial control over the colony. They informed Governor Robinson that if London refused to grant a local charter, they would incorporate under French or German law in Shanghai and operate as an extraterritorial bank beyond British legal oversight. Governor Robinson, realizing that the British Crown could not govern Hong Kong without the cooperation of Jardine, Dent, and Sassoon, backed the local merchants against London. In August 1866, the Hong Kong Legislative Council passed the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Ordinance, officially granting the new institution sovereign legal backing, limited liability, and the extraordinary privilege of issuing legal tender banknotes across the Crown Colony. In April 1865, the bank opened its second flagship branch on the Bund in Shanghai, cementing its control over both the southern and northern maritime axes of Chinese trade. In the heated debates of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, colonial attorney generals and merchant representatives argued late into the night. Sutherland and Dent made it unequivocally clear that Hong Kong's survival as a British colony depended entirely on retaining financial autonomy from London. By establishing a local board of directors comprising the leading merchant houses, HSBC created a closed, self-reinforcing credit loop. The merchants sat on the board that approved their own credit facilities, discounted their own bills of exchange, and guaranteed their own shipping consignments. While the merchant princes of Hong Kong were toasting the birth of their new banking empire, a catastrophic human and economic tragedy was unfolding across the cities, towns, and peasant villages of mainland China. To understand the true cost of the silver and opium circuit that financed HSBC, one must examine the fiscal collapse of the Qing dynasty under the Daeguang and Xianfeng emperors. For centuries, the everyday economy of imperial China operated on a delicate bimetallic monetary standard. Ordinary peasants, farmers, and artisans conducted daily business in cast copper coins with square center holes, known as cash, while government taxes, land rents, wholesale trade, and imperial treasury accounts were strictly calculated and payable in fine silver taels. Traditionally, the exchange rate had remained stable for generations at roughly 1,000 copper cash to 1 silver ounce. However, as the British opium trade drained hundreds of millions of ounces of silver out of China between 1820 and 1860, a severe, crippling silver famine gripped the empire. The fundamental laws of supply and demand operated with brutal efficiency. As silver became scarce, its value skyrocketed relative to copper. By the 1840s, a peasant had to pay between 2,000 and 2,500 copper coins to buy a single ounce of silver to pay his imperial land taxes. Millions of small landowners were forced into bankruptcy and debt peonage. Dispossessed peasants were forced to sell their ancestral lands to wealthy gentry landlords, falling into bonded debt peonage or flooding into the provincial cities as desperate, starving day laborers. In 1839, the Daeguang Emperor appointed Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu to halt the trade. Lin's destruction of British opium at Human triggered a response of overwhelming military violence from Great Britain. The First and Second Opium Wars resulted in humiliating treaties, the cession of Hong Kong, the legalization of opium, and massive war indemnities that drained the imperial treasury. The resulting economic devastation, combined with the rapid spread of opium addiction among imperial soldiers and government officials, shattered the administrative authority and moral prestige of the Qing dynasty. In the impoverished southern province of Guangxi, the economic misery and social breakdown directly fueled the rise of the Taiping Rebellion in 1850. Led by Hong Ziyuquan, a visionary who established the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the 14-year Civil War became the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century, leaving an estimated 20 to 30 million Chinese dead, devastating the richest agricultural provinces of the Yangtze River, and reducing the imperial government to absolute financial bankruptcy. The profound contradiction at the core of HSBC is that an institution celebrated as a cornerstone of Victorian financial stability was structurally designed to serve as the chief clearinghouse for the largest international narcotics trade in human history. Under the leadership of Sir Thomas Jackson, HSBC systematically institutionalized the financial circuits of the drug trade. When Indian opium was auctioned by the colonial government in Calcutta and Bombay, the purchasing syndicates, dominated by Jardine Matheson, Dent, the Sassoon family, and Parsi merchant houses, drew bills of exchange on HSBC in Hong Kong and Shanghai. The bank discounted these commercial paper instruments, provided maritime credit insurance, and accepted the proceeds of coastal drug sales in silver dollars. HSBC then converted these silver proceeds into international sterling drafts, transferring the astronomical profits back to London and British India to finance the administrative machinery of the British Raj. The narcotics business was the primary commercial engine that provided HSBC with its vast liquidity. In the 1870s and 1880s, over 70% of the foreign bills of exchange cleared through the bank were directly linked to the opium, tea, and silk triangle. The bank established the comprador system to bridge the gap with the Chinese merchant community and maintained vaults, holding millions of ounces of silver derived from narcotic sales. Under the tenure of Chief Manager Sir Thomas Jackson, HSBC constructed an elaborate network of subterranean silver vaults beneath its headquarters on Queen's Road in Hong Kong and on the Bund in Shanghai, guarded by armed Sikh and European sentries. These vaults held millions of ounces of silver sisy, Kerala's dollars, and Mexican dollars derived directly from the sale of narcotics along the Chinese coast. The bank maintained intimate relationships with the floating opium receiving stations, heavily armed hulks permanently anchored off Linton Island in Wusong, where private river smugglers exchanged raw silver for drug chests. HSBC agents in the treaty ports accepted the silver deposits directly from these receiving hulks, credited the merchants' accounts in Hong Kong, and issued telegraphic transfers to London, creating a frictionless, lightning-fast financial clearinghouse for international drug trafficking. The physical brutality of the drug trade, the squalid opium dens spreading across Chinese cities, the millions of addicted laborers and mandarins, the shattered families, was transformed through the alchemy of debenture bookkeeping into pristine, dividend-paying corporate assets. Furthermore, HSBC assumed the sovereign functions of a state central bank. In 1872, it was granted the monopoly to handle all government treasury accounts in Hong Kong. Its banknotes circulated as the primary paper currency throughout southern China, backed by the proceeds of an addiction crisis that was tearing apart Chinese civilization. The ultimate irony was complete. The British Empire had condemned private piracy and banned the domestic sale of narcotics in Great Britain. Yet its most prestigious colonial bank was built upon the sovereign laundering of illegal narcotics revenue, with its banknotes backed by the proceeds of an addiction crisis that was actively tearing apart the oldest civilization in Asia. As the Qing Empire disintegrated, HSBC transformed into the ultimate sovereign creditor of the Chinese state. The bank structured and managed the international loan syndicates required to pay massive foreign war indemnities. In exchange, HSBC and its consortium took direct control over China's primary sources of tax revenue, including the Imperial Maritime Customs Service and the salt tax monopolies. As the Qing Empire disintegrated, HSBC transformed into the ultimate sovereign creditor of the Chinese state. The bank structured and managed the international loan syndicates required to pay massive foreign war indemnities. In exchange, HSBC and its consortium took direct control over China's primary sources of tax revenue, including the Imperial Maritime Customs Service and the salt tax monopolies. HSBC achieved a form of financial imperialism, holding the legal deeds to the empire's national tax revenues. Its aggressive debt diplomacy eventually helped trigger the 1911 revolution, when the Qing court attempted to nationalize regional railway projects to pledge their revenues to HSBC. It sparked the railway protection movement, leading to the Wucheng Uprising and the end of 2 millennia of imperial rule. The human and political fallout was monumental. The drain of wealth and the loss of financial sovereignty crippled China's ability to modernize, leading directly to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in the Revolution of 1911 and plunging the country into decades of warlordism, social upheaval, and foreign occupation. The drug addiction that had funded the bank's initial expansion affected tens of millions of Chinese citizens, creating an enduring legacy of national humiliation that shaped modern Chinese politics for a century. Yet for HSBC, the operation was an overwhelming institutional triumph. The bank successfully navigated the fall of the Qing dynasty, the First and Second World Wars, the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, and the rise of the People's Republic of China in 1949. By adapting its operations and diversifying into global retail, commercial, and investment banking across London, New York, and Asia, HSBC emerged in the late 20th century as one of the largest multinational banking conglomerates in the world, managing trillions of dollars in assets while continuing to serve as the principal currency-issuing bank of Hong Kong. I want to be careful here, because this is precisely where serious economic history must be separated from simplistic moral melodrama. For over a century, popular narratives have often swung between two equally misleading extremes, portraying HSBC either as an immaculate champion of Victorian free market capitalism or as a sinister, cartoonish criminal syndicate operating entirely in the shadows. The founding of HSBC was not the work of rogue criminals, but the direct product of 19th-century British imperial state policy. The British government deliberately created and protected the opium trade because it resolved the empire's structural trade deficit. Without opium revenue, the fiscal balance of the British Empire would have collapsed. When the British East India Company lost its commercial monopoly on the China trade in 1833, the British government did not abolish the opium trade. Instead, it threw the trade open to private free enterprise, creating a hyper-competitive gold rush that dramatically increased the volume of narcotics entering China. British prime ministers, from Lord Palmerston to William Gladstone, understood that without the millions of pounds collected from Indian opium taxes and China tea customs, the entire fiscal balance of the British Empire would collapse into insolvency. The British Treasury relied on Indian opium revenue to pay for the military occupation of the subcontinent and to fund the Royal Navy. The respectable gentlemen who founded HSBC were operating as the functional, essential financial arms of a global imperial state. The merchants who founded HSBC were regarded as respectable pillars of Victorian society. They did not view themselves as drug traffickers. Opium was a legitimate international commodity sanctioned by royal treaties. The tragedy of the system was a systemic triumph of imperial political economy, where state power was used to enforce corporate profits at the expense of human life and foreign sovereignty. The enduring story of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation reveals that the world's most powerful financial institutions are often born from the convergence of state power, imperial geopolitics, and the legal laundering of extractive commodities. While the language of regulation has evolved, the underlying relationship between state-enforced monopolies and financial dominance remains identical. When global institutions claim that prosperity is the natural result of free enterprise, history demands that we trace the founding ledgers back to their origins. The enduring story of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation reveals that the world's most powerful financial institutions are often born from the convergence of state power, imperial geopolitics, and the legal laundering of extractive commodities. While the language of regulation has evolved, the underlying relationship between state-enforced monopolies and financial dominance remains identical. If you have made it this far, write the word ledger in the comments below, as a reminder that behind every towering skyscraper in global finance sits a historical balance sheet that power preferred to forget. And if you rely on this channel for the hidden financial ledgers beneath official history, subscribe to Chrono Dominion and join us for the next investigation into the transactions the powerful hope time would quietly erase.